So, if you haven't already heard of it, The Amazing Digital Circus is this incredible little web series that just premiered its pilot episode on YouTube. So, in light of this little piece of media releasing, I got a fun idea. What if I designed a little licensed game for the series as a creative exercise? I figured it'd be a good excuse to talk with y'all about what makes a good licensed game. By the way, if you haven't seen it already, what are you doing here? Go watch it. Go watch it now. It's really good. And it's free. It's free on YouTube. I love this short for so many reasons. For starters, the head animator is Kevin Toons, and I absolutely adore his stuff. Not only is his animation phenomenal, but he's also a really good songwriter. And I'm kind of honestly hoping that comes through in the show at some point. Because really, only he could write 2 whole songs about being depressed for kids.
What's the matter? What's the matter, Martha?
I also love it because it's made by the same people who made the SMG4 series. I remember way back when I was watching it, and I thought it was literally the funniest thing ever created. Then I showed it to my dad, and now, when I go to bed at night...
Welcome to Watch Mojo, and today we are counting down our picks for the top 10 most cringe-ass shit you have ever done.
I couldn't bring myself to watch it after that. Anyway, I also love it because it's just made by a bunch of really passionate people. I just love it when everyday people do and create things against all odds just because they're passionate about it. There's something profoundly special about that I can't really put into words, other than that it's really inspiring. Anyway, the biggest reason I'm absolutely in love with this series is its fantastic theming. It's a delightful fusion of quintessential 90s 3D computer graphics charm and early 3D mascot platformers. And as a computer man myself, I can't help but adore all the little details they put into it. The show clearly draws from early CG animation, from the chunky geometry, to the primitive PBR techniques present that give it that plasticky sheen, to the checkerboard tiling that was used in a lot of early animations in order to help people better judge the depth in a scene, especially before they were like shadows and ambient occlusion. And some of the things that clued me into it being inspired by early mascot platformers include how the tent is kind of designed as this open world sandbox area made up of obstacles that form these traversable layers, the janky early collision detection, to how the only adventure we've gone on up to this point is literally a collectathon. However, the game also has a ton of things that point to it being a lot more modern than it looks. For one, look at these shadows. Ain't no way the N64 casually pulling out PCSS filtered shadows. Like, ain't no way. Ain't no way. Also, while the models were designed in a way that would definitely make them feasible on lower end hardware, they have just so much geometry and squashing and smearing and stretching that really wasn't feasible at the time, especially with so many characters on screen. Also, look how fast they unload the tent and load in the tent's exterior. That's wild. Also, the game has this really nice looking filmic blur, as well as screen space bloom and ambient occlusion that just really weren't common in games around this time. This has brought me to 2 conclusions. The first is that in the world of the Amazing Digital Circus, this game is a highly advanced multiplayer VR game from the 90s. You know, one that would have been played on like, I think they're called the virtuality machines? I'll throw a picture up. One of these, you would have played it on one of these. And then, still within this universe, has been ported to modern hardware. This explains why the show co-opts the design and general aesthetic of 90s 3D media, but it also explains why so many advanced techniques are present. It's using the environment's original PBR shader, but then plugging in an extra UV channel in order to utilize newer and more advanced lighting techniques. It's using the original character's meshes, but updating them with modern geometry and vertex shader technology, as well as smooth shading. It has many loadable areas, but almost all of them can be instantly streamed off of a modern integrated SSD card. And the game could simply just record extra buffers like a motion buffer and a depth buffer in order to run all the post-processing effects. So, over the relatively short history of licensed games, there's been a huge paradigm shift in terms of what makes a good one. Well, okay, not in terms of what makes a good one, but in terms of what it takes for a licensed game to get made. Because 10 to 20 years ago, all it took for a game to get the green light from producers was simply the strength of the brand associated with it, and that's about it. And that was for a bunch of reasons, but it mostly boiled down to a lack of consumer awareness. At the time, it wasn't really as common to read a ton of reviews because that kind of information wasn't really available at the time. This was the 90s and early 2000s. Also, at that time, gaming was just a whole lot younger than it is now, meaning that people were just a whole lot less critical of the content they were consuming. And this is just kind of a problem for any new creative medium. Take early films, for example. They are pretty rough by today's standards. So rough, in fact, I'd argue that most filmmakers today, even some amateurs, could probably make a better film than almost any other around that time, even if they used the same exact technology that they were using. However, the only reason they'd be able to do so is because they'd be working off of hundreds of years of precedent set by thousands of other filmmakers before them. This person would be able to bypass the early trial and error stages of filmmaking because they would already know what a good film looked like, what it sounded like, how it's paced, or how it's framed. And how this applies to licensed games extends further than just the filmmakers, and onto their audiences as well. They too have not been predisposed to what a good film looks like, and as such, their expectations were lower overall for it. Because at that time, seeing a moving picture for yourself was an incredible spectacle in its own right. By the way, when I say good, I'm not saying that there's some objective good standard, because art's subjective. And finally, at that time, the idea of a trash bargain bin license game hadn't really become a part of the common consumer psyche. People would rightly think, surely Barbie's Big Pack Blowout couldn't be that bad, right? So today, it takes a lot more than just a big brand backing a title in order to get people interested in playing a new release. So, what exactly makes a great licensed game today? Well, I'd say the most important criteria for modern licensed games is that a good licensed game is just a good game that uses an IP. I know, earth-shattering wisdom. Me when the game is good, when it is good and not But seriously though, putting it more bluntly, a licensed game should be able to stand on its own, even if it doesn't have the original IP backing it. Here are some simple questions you can ask yourself to see if your licensed game meets this criterion. If my game didn't have this IP, would it still be considered good? Is my game remotely unique enough to stand up against a world of other similar games on the same platform without this IP? Does my game still have a unique hook without its IP? If your licensed game failed one of these criteria, it doesn't necessarily mean that your licensed game is bad, but you should really consider why it failed those criteria, and whether or not you're using the IP as a crutch to support an otherwise kind of lackluster game. I think a really good example of this is Spider-Man 2018. So, is the game still good without the IP? Yeah, it's still really great. The game is really known for its great mechanics and feel and scale. It's not really dependent on the IP for all that. Is my game still unique enough to stand up on its own? And does it still have a good hook? I'd say, yeah, definitely. The game has a really unique take on the open world genre that's kind of started to become stale-ish. With its unique verticality and traversal accompanied with the AAA graphics, it's honestly really awesome on its own. Okay, so now that we've covered this admittedly pretty obvious criterion, let's cover what could make licensed games better moving forward. While I am entering speculative territory, and this might sound like a bit of a contradiction to the first point, the second criterion for creating a really good licensed game is taking what made the original IP so good in the first place and expanding on that. But before I elaborate on that, I just have a question for you. Do y'all remember Avatar: The Last Airbender? Let's hope this doesn't look like trash in post. When thinking back on the show, what are some of the things that made it truly special? Was it the cast of characters? Maybe it was the exciting plot. Maybe it was the humor.
If you want a boy to like you, just look at him and smile a lot and laugh at everything he says, even if it's not funny.
Well, that sounds really shallow and stupid.
Let's try it. Okay. Hey there, sweet sugar cakes.
But you know what my favorite part was? When Team Avatar came together to solve a sliding block puzzle. If fans of the original IP go play this game, and this game is just a platformer with the characters of the original IP, they're probably just gonna be a little disappointed. Because the reason why everyone fell in love with the original IP wasn't the fact that the characters from the original IP had the physical ability to run and jump and push a block. I'm gonna be real with y'all for a second. It was really difficult to come up with this second criterion, as obvious as it may be, because there are just like so many games that fail the first criterion that it's hard to have like a huge sample set of games that I can look at to improve, because like that's where you gotta start. You gotta start with the first thing, the most important thing. So I ended up using other mediums for design inspiration, mainly theme parks. They've had over 60 years to get the whole licensed property translation formula right, so here's what I sampled from researching that. There are a ton of differences between standard theme parks and licensed theme parks. Where standard theme parks are all about rides and games, licensed theme parks have a much greater emphasis on look, feel, and overall guest experience. In standard theme parks, rides, attractions, games, food, adverts are all pushed really close together and then scattered about the park, prioritizing quantity over quality. On the other hand, licensed theme parks are a lot more tightly designed around a much smaller, higher quality set of rides and attractions. They're normally spread across a larger area to make you feel more like you're exploring a new place. In addition, licensed theme parks are usually a lot more interactive and based way more around interpersonal experiences. And finally, licensed theme parks are made really special through close collaboration with the original developers of the IP. So how do these apply to licensed games? Well, for starters, they suggest that licensed games should prioritize overall experience and immersion over standard and conventional gameplay mechanics. It's not just about using characters of the brand, it's about recreating the essence of the original IP. And ultimately, I really think you should ask yourself what your fans really want from this IP. So, it was really difficult to come up with a direction to go with when creating this design. My first thought is, the game should definitely be pretty meta, as the show itself is pretty meta. And the big reason I'd say the show is meta is because, like, we're literally introduced to the world by Cade in, like, the opening moments of the game. Like, we literally, like, we go from this, like, pixelated, like, monitor and, like, zooming literally into the world. Like, this is, like, the most meta show. Like, we have to make it meta. It has to be. Like, everything about the show is so meta. And the show itself is already literally a game. Might as well let them play in it. However, the show's primary premise directly conflicts with this idea. I mean, how do you have a world that's commonly marketed to you as like, everyone here is miserable and wants to leave and is so unhappy, and then on the other hand be like, no, but please play this other metagame? Another thing that the show has going against it is its genre. The show is a comedy and focuses a lot on like characters and their interactions, and that makes it really difficult to design around. Unlike an action TV show where you can just translate that action to the game, or like a horror show where you can put the player or the viewer directly into that experience, comedy's hard because it has to do with people. When a lot of the appeal of a piece of media comes down to its characters or its people, it becomes really hard to translate that over to a game. Games are inherently interactive, and so it's just really difficult to replicate that kind of feeling you get when you're watching the piece of media with the person versus playing a game with that person. All of that is to say that I really needed to play around with how I designed the game in order to accommodate for these challenges, if that makes sense. And from there, all I needed to do was sketch out and design an idea for this game, and after some time, I came back with this. So for this design, I'm going with what I'm going to be coining an unlimited social survival game. So the reason I'm calling it that is because it abbreviates to US, you know, like... Among Us! It's basically like one of those elimination-based games, except every time a player gets eliminated, or in this case abstracted, new players are added. Another departure from most other social survival games is that instead of each game only lasting a single play session, players instead leave the game at the end of each round and then reconvene at the same time every X number of days in order to continue playing the game. The game's endlessness serves two purposes. First, it mirrors the show's themes of being a perpetual, endless cycle of insanity. And secondly, it enhances what makes the show special, that being creating interesting interactions and relationships between characters, or players in this case. The reason it achieves this is because when player interactions and relationships can't last any longer than a single normal length play session, they end up not really meaning anything. If you end up getting abstracted, it's kinda just like, oh well, that really couldn't have gone on much longer anyway. I'll just do it again. However, rounds also can't just go on forever, because most people have lives and can't sink an unimaginable amount of time into the funny hee-hee circus game show game. Unlike me. Probably one of the biggest factors in this whole design, other than its core, is the sheer amount of randomness present. Almost everything that happens to you is completely out of your control, leaving you to decide what to do about it. Whenever you enter a random new game, you'll get a random player model. Each round in that game will start with a random number of new players being added to the game via a little talk show style interview, followed by a random adventure and then a randomized abstraction method, which can include completely randomized abstraction, vote-based, and challenge-based. By having all these layers of randomness, the game can not only remain fresh and interesting for much longer, but it also helps contributes to the game's overall sense of zaniness, tying it back to some of the themes of the show. Being its main form of content, the game would need a boatload of adventures to keep things interesting. They would vary heavily in terms of gameplay type, from cooperative to competitive. Some might require a bit of roleplay and acting and improv, and a lot of them would be just like incredibly stupid. The goal of all of them is to create interesting social situations and interactions amongst the players. Here's just a few adventure concepts I came up with. Pairing up into teams of two to make the fanciest ice sculpture for this very fancy looking martini NPC. Using this playset submarine thing I made to explore a 10,000 foot ball pit. Dividing up to play out an interstellar court case with a bunch of sentient vacuums. Going on a super long road trip from Arizona to Vegas. Or even planning like a little surprise party in the woods for a bunch of very nosy ghosts. So here's the game's twist. Each round, if a player finds a way to fundamentally break or ruin a challenge for everyone else, they can grant immunity to any two players, one of which can be themselves, and will cause an extra player to get abstracted. But not only does this addition better conform to how the characters are portrayed in the show, but it also harkens back to what makes the show special in the first place as a comedy, as it'll trigger behaviors in the players that could be quite hilarious. Kind of in the same way that, like, trolls are funny. Except that in this game, that might actually be the most viable strategy. So, this design still has some issues. For one, it's still missing a lot of what made the show great. Sure, the comedy and interesting character interactions are very important, you might say. But I wanted to see the Digital Circus characters from the show. What the hell? Or you might be saying, I actually wanted to know more about the worlds and the lores. There are also some other big issues in the current design. Like, for instance, losing a game is just insanely sucky, and like, I don't want it to suck so much that they just never want to play it again, and players don't really have anything to do before and after rounds. So, that's where the final part of my design comes into play. The single player. So, before and after each round, by exploring the tent area, you can come across these little exit doors. In them, you can poke around for, like, lore and junk. I don't know what that would look like, use your imagination. It has no bearing on anything in the show side, so there's really no pressure to explore it if you have no interest in doing it or have no time to do so. Additionally, whenever you lose the show and abstract, you get to do a little single-player section that will shed a little bit of light on the previous lives of one of the characters from the show. So yeah, that's my little game design outline. It took kind of a buttload of work, but I hope y'all thought it was cool. I would have loved to gone in depth on some of the more technical aspects of how the game would have run and actually worked, but I figured given the video subject topic, I should keep the video accessible to like a general audience, if that makes sense. If y'all couldn't tell, this video was just kind of an excuse to talk about licensed game design and how I think it could be better, considering the current state of them. Or I guess previous state. A lot of recent stuff's been a lot better. Also keep in mind this isn't a real product, it's just like a fun little design thing.